there are certain industries where modern slavery is more prevalent, or as investors would say, is more material. And for those industries, the level of disclosure that it would be required in regards to due diligence to prevent, let's say, modern slavery in the supply chain, it's higher. So we are able to identify at the industry level, particularly those high exposed industries, what are companies doing to manage those risks.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director of Media at ISS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land, and we pay our respects to the traditional custodians of country and elders past and present. Today's guest is Mirtha Kastrapeli, Global Head of ISS STOXX Research Institute, and here in Australia for the IGCC conference. Mirtha, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
For those who are not familiar with the ISS STOXX Research Institute, can you tell us about the work you do globally and here in Australia?
Yeah, so the ISS Research Institute is a firm-wide initiative, and our work is really dedicated to help our global institutional investors' clients that are interested in incorporating social, environmental, and governance considerations in their investment decision-making process. And I'm here in Australia for many reasons, but one of them is for a collaboration we did with Mercer on their upcoming work on circularity and our contributions to a case study on the chemicals industry.
Good choice on coming to Sydney around springtime. And yes, so I know that the annual investor group on climate change conference is on, and certainly everyone's waiting for this upcoming report from Mercer, which would really shed some light on what is important to know for investors and lenders about circularity. But for this episode, I thought we could focus on discussing nature and why it's important to talk about nature from the lens of an institutional investor, for example, an Australian super fund. So let's kick off with definitions. What do we mean by nature when we talk about it from an investment context?
So nature is basically everything that's around us. So natures are the natural resources that the economy and the well-being, our well-being depends on, but also the ecosystem services that nature provides to us. Now, in regards to how our institutional investors traditionally have seen nature over the past few years, particularly since we had the Global Biodiversity Framework, the conversation was really around nature-related impacts and what that means in regards to a particular portfolio and what are some of the implications with some regulatory requirements. But now, again, the conversation is shifting towards nature-related risk. And that's, again, an area that we continue to do more work on.
Fantastic. And certainly we've seen that even with our coverage of the industry, where before it was about, well, how would nature impact our portfolio? That was what the sense was. But these days, it is definitely about nature-related risks. But again, what do we mean by nature-related risks?
So the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD, classifies risk, nature-related risk, in three types. The first one is physical risk, again, how a particular nature asset, if you will, or ecosystem service could have an impact or impacts a business operations or in the supply chain, more importantly, in a lot of cases. So that's what we call physical risk. In regards to transition risk, it's related to changing regulation that could have an impact on a company's operations in regards to nature-related issues, or it could be reputational risk as we see a shift in market preferences. And lastly, systemic risk. It's a risk that affects not a particular issuer or an industry, but the whole system. And that's a type of risk that is particularly relevant for those long-term investors, given that they cannot necessarily diversify away from that type of systemic risk. So those are the three types of nature-related risks that we see in the market.
And I know that many super funds understand what systemic risks are, even if it's not really ESG related. But how do you measure the information, if you like, across all those risks? Is there data available now that allows you to do that?
Yes. So the topic of nature-related risk and what data is available to measure those risks, that's at the heart of a lot of the research that we're doing at the Institute, but also across the ISS STOXX organization. So the data we have now, it's on the risk side is we have some what is called model data. So looking at models that assess ecosystem services dependencies, and we're able to identify a portfolio, how portfolio is dependent on particular ecosystems. So ecosystem services can be classified as regulatory and maintenance, meaning how the dependence of how nature supports natural processes like pollination or water purification or carbon sequestration. We can have also ecosystem services related to provisioning, which is direct economic benefits from nature, such as food or wood or natural gas. And then there's the cultural benefits or ecosystem services that are more related to recreation or cultural activities. So we're able to not only organize these ecosystem services in these three buckets, but there's also 22 underlying more specific ecosystem services, such as groundwater, access to groundwater or fresh water, that we're able with these models identify dependencies, again, at a portfolio level, but even at the issuer level. So that's one type of nature-related data that is available today to start the conversations around dependencies. And in addition to that, and I'm not going to go into detail here, is obviously the new generation, which is geospatial data that is going to give you location-specific assessments in what are some of the particular vulnerabilities at the asset level, vulnerabilities such as wildfire risk or water stress areas. And this is, again, another area that is emerging in the space, and also ISX has made some important investments to provide this type of information to our clients.
And do you find that over the past decade or so, that publicly disclosed data has improved, or are we still kind of trying to make sure that we can filter out good data versus questionable data?
No, that's a great point. So what we call performance data, right? So we talked about model data, we talk about geospatial data, but performance data really comes from companies' disclosures of their impacts, dependencies, but more importantly, what policies or practices they have in place to address those nature-related risks and opportunities. Now, with TNFD, as I mentioned earlier, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, we are expecting that companies are going to improve and expand their disclosures on those nature dependencies and impacts. Now, because we're not there yet, and that will take time for corporates to get to, again, in critical mass to start adopting the TNFD frameworks and recommendations using what is called the LEAP framework. Because we're not there yet, obviously, we need to kind of fill in the gap with some of those models and geospatial data that I mentioned. Having said that, there is plenty of disclosed information or reported data that we have available today, particularly in high impact or high dependent industries, such as the chemicals industry or the food industry, agriculture, where disclosure for certain areas, let's say water usage or other themes, is already advanced. So we want to be able to leverage the disclosure that we have today, understanding that gaps still exist.
You mentioned the chemicals industry there. So for our listeners who are always keen on case studies, can you explain or perhaps tell us about maybe what you've done in the industry and how that's helped?
Yeah, so the case study, and again, this is related to, just to put the context on the circular economy based on the really fantastic report coming from Mercer in the coming weeks, is that we're looking at the framework of circularity, that a framework that was developed by the WPCSD that talks about different aspects of circularity, optimizing the loop, closing the loop, value in the loop, and the impact of the loop. So based on that framework, we got, or we focus on the chemicals industry, which is an industry that is foundational for many other industries. It's called the industries of industries. And they produce things like fertilizers and pesticides all the way to specialty chemicals. So again, it has a very much of a foundational characteristic, let's say, in the market. So we wanted to map what are some of those indicators, reported data on various topics that would feed into some of those circularity buckets, if you will. So in our case study, we looked at wastewater management. Again, a big expense for a chemicals industry, given the incredible impact that the chemical industry has on water. And we're able to identify that as a closing the loop activity. And we were able to see, based on those disclosures, what are some of the leaders and laggards in that space. So if you're developing a strategy, you can identify which chemical company is kind of taking a more proactive or a more active role in, let's say, wastewater management that would be aligned with a circular strategy. Similarly, we have on the optimizing the loop, right? We have indicators like freshwater intensity or water stress risk evaluation that we're assessing today in the industry. And again, we're able to identify specific issuers that may be leaders or laggards in the space.
So put another way, this really provides a lot of superannuation funds who are new to looking at nature-related risks to really assess almost a granular level, should they invest in this company based on what they do, if it's related to the chemical sector, or they can at least weigh who are the leaders, laggards, and those who are making an effort in improving their numbers, if you like.
That's exactly right. Again, the use case for this type of data would be, to your point, a stock selection. If you, let's say, are looking to develop a circular economy strategy, but also it could be useful for engagement, right? So if you have companies in your portfolio that may be laggards in certain topics like wastewater management, for example, you could use this information to support your engagement efforts.
Now, this is such a comprehensive topic. We haven't even touched regenerative agriculture or even modern slavery. So, for example, last year at the IGCC, modern slavery was a topic that was on center stage. So one of the super funds, in fact, was quoted talking about modern slavery. Is there anything else you'd like to mention that super funds should really look at in terms of their performance indicators, for example, or just in the context of what's going to be released in the circular report?
Yes, no, I think the topic of modern slavery has come up in my meetings while visiting Australia, so clearly top of mind for a lot of investors, but not only in Australia, in many parts of the world. There are certain industries where modern slavery is more prevalent, or as investors would say, is more material. And for those industries, the level of disclosure that it would be required in regards to due diligence to prevent, let's say, modern slavery in the supply chain, it's higher. So we are able to identify at the industry level, particularly those high exposed industries, what are companies doing to manage those risks. We understand that those risks exist, but the question for an investor is, what are companies doing about it? And this is the type of information we have today. We have a modern slavery scorecard also that is available, that is part of the ISS STOXX solution suite. And is something that, again, when we talk about there's a lack of data, we said there's plenty of data, particularly on those high risk industries in the topic like modern slavery.
Well said. Mirtha, I hope we will have a part 2. But for now, thanks for joining us and hope you enjoyed your visit.
Thank you so much.
This is The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar. Thank you for listening.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.